Welcome to Spooky Hours. My name's David Saunderson, and today we're talking to author Mark Egerton about his book, The Haunted History of Huntingdonshire. How are you, Mark?
I'm very well, thank you, David.
It's a very hot day today, so we might both be sweating on camera.
Yes, it is rather warm.
It's probably the spookiest thing about England when it actually gets hot. That's something that people probably don't know. They're out in the world that we actually do sweat here. Now, I was very interested when I first saw that there was a book called The Haunted History of Huntingdonshire, because it's not it's not a county that many people would know about. Why is that?
Well, to be honest, it's not a county that exists anymore in its own right. It was a very old county, most famous for the birthplace of Oliver Cromwell. But in 1974, it was absorbed into Cambridgeshire, but it's retained, it's a district now. And they retained the old county name, basically because of historical figures linked to the old county, namely Cromwell. Catherine of Aragon died in Huntingdonshire, and also the famous diarist Samuel Pepys was educated in Huntingdonshire and spent a large proportion of his life here.
It's for people that don't know, and I mean, look it up on Google, but it's essentially south of Peterborough and north of Cambridge is the district now. Is that correct?
Well, it's about 18 miles. We're 18 miles west of Cambridge, roughly. It's about a 40 minute car journey to Cambridge from here.
Okay. How did you first become interested in the paranormal?
Well, that was a very long time ago in 1976 when I was 15. And I had a paranormal experience myself in broad daylight. And I came home and told my parents about it, and they were highly supportive. They said, "Don't be so stupid, boy." But luckily, my mother had a sister, and she was married to a gentleman called Trevor Kenwood, who was a long-term Ghost Club member. And he lived in Dorset, but a couple of weeks later, he came to visit Marilyn, my mum's sister's mother here, and he interviewed me about it and believed what I told him. He was experienced in interviewing people that had seen apparitions, and I became fascinated with the subject from there. But of course, in those days, the Ghost Club was very select. You could only become a member by being, by invitation. And secondly, I was 15, so I wasn't old enough to really be involved with that sort of thing. And so I took an interest in the sort of haunted history of my surroundings, really, which was Huntingdonshire. And that's where the fascination began. And I thought I would sort of embark on this journey where I would see lots and lots of ghosts. I've never seen another one. Okay. That was 1976. I've experienced paranormal activity, but I've never seen an apparition, another one.
Well, how do you define paranormal activity if you don't think, what does that mean?
To me, paranormal means something that science is yet to be able to find a logical explanation for. So, it encompasses a whole range of things within the paranormal world, like extraterrestrial intelligence and crop circles in fields and stuff like that. But they never really interested me too much, to be quite honest with you. I sort of, at a very early age, sort of took on board with life on other planets that it was highly probable. And so it sort of lost its fascination. But because I think I'd had that experience myself, and I knew that I wasn't drunk or mentally ill or all the things that some people are charged with when they say they've seen a ghost or an apparition, the interest came from there. And I started doing what I could, mainly in the way of research. And in those days, of course, there was no internet. So it was a case of getting to the library and sort of reading up accounts. And if people were around and still living, checking in with them and asking them if they could tell me about it. And I was quite meticulous in recording stuff. And so I kept stuff right back from the 70s. When I decided to write the book, I basically decided to write the book because my mother's sister, Marilyn, Trevor's wife, she'd been on at me for 20 odd years. I had a couple of kids, work, you know what it is. Sitting down and writing a book takes a long time. So I never got round to it. And then she was diagnosed with cancer and she passed away. I didn't actually make a promise to her, but I said to her that I would write a book. So when I wrote it, it wasn't written as a commercial venture, really. It was really written for her. And so I tried to do, the best possible job I could with it, really. And it started off with, I was going to write a book about Huntingdonshire's ghosts, myths and legends. And then as I started to do the research, a lot of fascinating historical facts sort of came up. For instance, people like Pepys, Cromwell, and various other things. I mean, the one that I tend to say is a mile up the road from me is a little village called Diddington, which blink and you'd miss it. And I knew that there was a hospital there during the Second World War, and it wasn't a little hospital; it had 1,000 beds. It was the second biggest, and it had a ghost story attached to it. And so when I actually started doing the research on the ghost story, I discovered that Bing Crosby and Bob Hope had performed there, and then I found out that when it went that Rula Lenska, the actress, was born in a field there in one of these hospital wards, sort of that existed from the hospital days. And I sort of thought, wow, I've lived here all my life, and I didn't know that. I'll put that in the book. And then sort of thirdly, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to actually spend a night in some of these places and record what happens? And that's what I've done. Some of them, nothing happened at all. And that's what's in the book. I put in there an honest verdict of what we experienced. Didn't see any ghosts, I'm afraid, but we did get one or two interesting bits. As in most of them, the 40 years I've been sort of involved with this, I would say that 50% of the time, if you do an investigation, there's absolutely nothing. 40% of the time, there's something that's inconclusive. So it's really the 10% of the time that's really interesting. So ghost paranormal investigating, I hate the word ghost hunting, can be pretty boring, really, because most of the time nothing happens.
So what was some of the more interesting? You were saying that you visited some of these places and nothing happened. Can you maybe give us a little hint of maybe some of the things that are a bit more interesting, or that did sort of think what's going on here?
Well, just up the road from me, about 2 miles north of me, where I am now, is a place called Buckton. And there's a place there called Buckton Towers. It was actually Buckton Palace. And it was where Catherine of Aragon was held for about 10 months. And we spent the night in there, and we got quite a lot of odd things that happened. We had a cooker turn itself on, and I don't mean it was this sort of weather. And I mean, it wasn't just sort of turned on slightly. The heat pan was on full blast. And some people experienced a sort of strange something come under a door and then be pulled back under the door. It's quite complicated to explain, but it was almost as if someone had tipped oil from underneath the door on the other side, and it seeped through. And then when they became aware of it, and the good thing about it was 4 people witnessed it. So I'm always very skeptical if I never do a lone paranormal investigation, and Peter Underwood taught me that. He said if you do a lone paranormal investigation, A, you don't know what you're dealing with, and you might get into trouble. And B, if you do get anything happen, you've got no witnesses to verify it other than yourself. And as you'll probably know if you're interested in this, 9 times out of 10 people will, even if you provide them a photograph, they'll say, oh, it's been photoshopped, or CGI image on film, or inconclusive. So I long ago sort of gave up with wanting to prove to the world that the paranormal exists. I really do it for my own interest.
You mentioned Peter Underwood before. How much sort of contact did you have with him over the years?
I only met Peter a couple of times, and that was down to Trevor. He was Trevor's cousin. And the first time I met him was very briefly. I don't know if you're aware, but Peter's roots are in a place called Letchworth in Hertfordshire. Okay. And Trevor was up here visiting from Dorset with his wife, my mum's sister. And I met him for about half an hour. But the second time I met him, we actually sat in a pub with quite an interesting haunted history. It was called the Anchor Hotel at Tempsford, and spent the afternoon with him in a beer garden, which was quite interesting.
And what did you? How did you find him? What kind of chap was he?
I found him to be very. He was very matter of fact. He was interested that I'd got an interest, and of course he knew that I was a relative of Trevor's. Or I wasn't really a relative of Trevor's. I was a relative. His
was in-laws.
Yeah, you know what I mean. So yeah, we sat in the garden in the afternoon talking stuff, and getting into sort of quite deep conversations, and it was quite enlightening for me. I was probably in my early 20s then, and I told him what I was doing, and we discussed the very first place that I did a paranormal investigation, because it was a place that he was very familiar with, a place called the Ferry Boat Inn at Needingworth, where an associate of his called Tony Cornell. I don't know if you're familiar with Tony, but Tony had done quite an investigation there in the early 50s. And I didn't know that, but Peter did. So when I actually put my book together, I explored the Ferry Boat Inn and was able to find the actual transcripts in the library archives of a seance that Tony Cornell had undertaken there. And it was quite funny because they sort of started this seance in the 1950s. And of course, at 11 o'clock, the pubs used to shut then. So they kicked them out and they went to the Blue Boar Hotel in Cambridge and recommenced the seance there, which is a bit bizarre, but obviously different times.
We're all kind of coming out of lockdown at the moment, and some of the pubs and restaurants and all that will be able to open next week. What are some of your favourite haunted pubs in Huntingdonshire district?
Well, there's a number of pubs that I quite like. My probably favourite in Huntingdonshire is in this village of Buckton, where Buckton Towers is, or Buckton Palace. It was involved with the Bishop of Lincoln, and there's a pub there called the Lion. It's dated 1492, and it's got a grey lady, or a lavender lady, she's sometimes referred to, as people get their paranormal smell of lavender. And I don't consider myself to be a sensitive, but when I walk into there, especially to the area where the toilets now are, I don't know if it's because of my knowledge of the place, but I feel something there. And generally, when I go to a place that has a haunted reputation, I sort of go into skeptical mode. I want to see something,
And what's this place called again? Sorry.
It's called the Lion Hotel.
Lion Hotel.
And it's got another hotel right opposite. They're both, the Lion was actually built in 1492, and it was like a guest house for Buckton Palace next door. Buckton Palace was the home of the Bishop of Lincoln. So it looks like something out of a film set, but a lot of people don't even know it exists. When my book came out and I was doing some talks, people said, "Oh, I've never heard of this place, didn't know it existed." And it is quite... if you have a look at any pictures on it online, you'll see it's very impressive.
Okay, well, something we need to. I always wonder. There's lots of haunted pubs around, but they're not all in the same town. Is that a place you'd say it's worth going to? Maybe stay the night in that town and visit some of the places, or is it more you've got to travel around a bit to get the full experience of haunted Huntingdonshire?
Well, what I did in my book was I wrote the book alphabetically. It starts with a village called Abbottsley, and it finishes with a village called Wearsley. So it runs through Buckton's at the front end of the book. And the book is not just about places. I've written in the book that the Ferry Boat Inn, for instance, I've actually poo-pooed that as a haunted place because it's an anniversary haunting. It's supposed to happen on the 17th of March. I must have been there 15, 20 times on the 17th. And I've interviewed a lot of other people too. And when I saw Tony Cornell's research, it sort of tallied in with me that there isn't really any evidence. It's more hearsay folklore than anything tangible that you can say, well, actually, that's unusual and that's difficult to explain.
Do any of the publicans or any people around it actually have experienced anything not on that day, like other days of the year?
Well, not that I'm aware of. Unfortunately, the pub is now, like many pubs, it's sort of one of these places that has a manager, and the managers change every sort of couple of years or sometimes less time than that. So it's very difficult. And of course, so many of our pubs, the one it starts the book off is in a place called Abbottsley. Like many others, it's no longer a pub. I wrote the book in 2015. Doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah. So I mean that is the disappointing thing about some of these pubs. Are there other places or any sort of tourist locations? You've mentioned quite a lot of famous people like Catherine of Aragon and stuff like that. Is there places people can actually physically go into and experience?
Well, probably the main areas are Buckton Towers is accessible. You can walk around the grounds there. It's open to the general public. I mentioned Buckton because in Buckton you've got the Lion Hotel, you've got the George Hotel right opposite, and you've got Buckton Towers. Literally in the space of 100 yards, you've got those three locations, and they're nice locations to have a look at. If you don't get anything paranormal, they're places it's nice to visit. Um, there's some in St Neots, which is about 3 miles to the south of me. Huntingdon, obviously.
You keep saying the south of you. Can you tell us where you are so people can actually get an idea
Yeah,
of where you
yeah.
are?
I'm about 18 miles to the west of Cambridge. I'm about 60 miles north of London. And the nearest, I'm sort of directly between the two major towns are St Neots and Huntingdon. And I'm about halfway between them.
Okay, that gives you an idea. Because you keep saying where you are, and people are probably going, "Where are
Yeah.
you? Where are you?" So continue on. Sorry.
So yes, there's a number of what some people have done, which I've been quite pleased with the book, is they've actually sort of used the book as a guide, and they've literally gone around because it's written in such a way. They've gone to the places that feature in the book, and as I said, like the Ferryboat Inn, which is probably one of Huntingdonshire's most famous ghost stories. I couldn't I couldn't find enough evidence there to suggest that it was genuine. And I think, to be quite honest, it was a rouse to get people in the pub. It's like the Dick Turpin saga. You know, Dick Turpin haunts about every pub in the country because,
Yeah.
people are curious. It attracts them. It brings them in. They spend money.
It's also fun, and that's where we love that kind of stuff anyway. We just hope there's
Yeah.
maybe some kind of a story behind it. So you've done this book, and you've sort of you've obviously, this was your own area, so you had a personal stake in wanting to find out more about the place you grew up and and live. Have you got any other future projects in mind that you might want to do next?
Well, a number of people have said to me, when are you going to write another book, Mark? But what I've tended to do is I've got a couple of pages on Facebook. One is called The Haunted History of Huntingdonshire, and everything contained in there is Huntingdonshire related. And then I've got another group that I ran, and I just sort of ran it for a interest, really, something to do. I'd had an operation and I was sitting around, and I've got one called Haunted History, which covers the whole of the UK and sometimes beyond the UK, occasionally, not very often. And those groups, I think there's over 5,000 people follow them now, so I assume that they must like it, and I think it's probably because of the format with the book. It's very much different to your normal ghost book in that it has lots of illustrations in it. It has 300 images and illustrations. It's totally naive by me. It cost an absolute fortune to print because 95% of them are colour, and it's A4 size, so it was enormously expensive. But as I said, I didn't write it actually to sell it. I just hope to get some copies in the library and just to keep those sort of things alive.
That sounds like a very worthwhile thing to do. So anyway, thank you for that. You've given us a lot of good ideas now that the summertime's here. It's definitely hot today, so we can maybe spend some time going off to the Huntingdonshire district and finding out more about some of these ghosts that you've told us about.
Well, I think it's a place which people would be quite astounded at if they actually come and look at some of the locations. It's a very nice part of the world.
Okay, well, thank you. You have a great day, Mark, and we'll talk to you later. Okay.
Thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.